Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 32 and 33. So let's begin. Izuku knew there were other kids from his year level around him, he just didn't focus on them. All he was focused on was putting one foot after the other as fast as he could. In his vision, the finish line loomed impossibly large. His lungs burned, his feet pounded the track, and then he was over it and slowing down. Izuku gulped in great lungfuls of air as he kept walking. It was the best way to avoid getting too cold. If that happened, he'd be stiff. He looked at the results board. Usually he wasn't that competitive, but this was their school sports festival, and it had been the final of the 100-meter dash. On the stands the rest of the school sat, though he knew most of them weren't interested in the fourth-year results, he could still hear cheering from his level. There were some parents on the other side. Dad hadn't managed to get here, but Kurogiri was there, with a grumpy Tomura, and Gigantamakia stood beside the stadium and looked as if he was holding it up himself. The results came up and Izuku felt elation. He'd won. He grinned. Hitoshi had made it to the semi-final but had come in 6th, and that wasn't good enough to get into the final. Only the top 4 out of each semi-final had made it. Shigeru and Naoki hadn't made it that far. They got through the heats, though Naoki had done better on the longer distances. He'd come in 5th overall. Izuku had come in 2nd to Akio, who had a mutant quirk. You couldn't turn off mutant quirks, so no one was going to beat Akio on a distance run. Even Akio had congratulated him. What? There was a cry from his side. Izuku turned and immediately the good feeling faded. Setsuna spun and growled at him. He suddenly remembered that she'd come 3rd to him in the long distance. And 2nd to him in the... Izuku held up his hands placatingly. No. She yelled in response. You do not get to do that. He just looked at her, aware that the other students were backing away. There was some call for them to clear the track so they could run the final of the 5th years. You say you aren't training, but you always beat me. You must be cheating. Setsuna howled. I didn't use my quirk. Izuku objected. He really hadn't. You must be. How could you beat me? She stomped one foot on the ground as her hands formed into fists. I just did my best. Izuku told her. That's really all he'd ever done. Arg! Setsuna screamed, and Izuku was shocked when she swung her fist at him. He saw it coming. There was no way he couldn't see it coming, and without thinking he dodged. Setsuna screamed louder and swung her other arm at him. Izuku dodged again. Her patterns were rather like Tomura. Cheater! I didn't use my quirk. Izuku cried out louder. The commotion finally brought the attention of a teacher, and Izuku saw there were several hurrying over. You must have. Setsuna insisted. There's no way you could beat me. I didn't. Izuku insisted. Mr. Rikuho looked down at them both. Izuku? He asked. The green-haired boy felt his stomach sink. He actually felt nauseous. He knew that tone. I didn't use my quirk, he repeated. Izuku, their pair teacher said softly. Is there some aspect of your quirk that gives you enhancement? Maybe like a mutant quirk that you can't turn off? Mr. Rikuho pressed. I'm fireproof, Izuku said. That's all. There is no other aspect. Izuku, Mr. Rikuho tried again. It's okay if there is. We just have to register it. There isn't, he reiterated. There has to be. Setsuna growled. There's no way he could have beaten me. She asserted. Let's move to the side, Mr. Rikuho said. The other teacher standing with him nodded. Izuku didn't know who they were. The woman taught one of the upper year levels. The small group shifted. I didn't use my quirk. Izuku tried one last time. I just tried my best. I'm sure you did, sweetie, the other teacher said. But Setsuna is the woman seemed to fish around for the right word. She's been trained by professionals, the teacher eventually said. She finished 1st in the Kanto regional trials. Mr. Rikuho nodded, and Setsuna simply looked proud. I didn't cheat, Izuku cried, looking down at the ground. Why didn't they believe him? From the corner of his eyes he saw Mr. Rikuho exchange a glance with the other teacher. There was definite meaning there. We'll have to run trials, the woman agreed. Izuku, Mr. Rikuho spoke to him. Again, Izuku recognized the tone of voice. From the way Setsuna seemed to jump on the balls of her feet, she did as well. A grin passed over her features. We're going to have to disqualify you for using an unregistered part of your quirk. I didn't, Izuku interrupted. It's not your fault, son, Mr. Rikuho told him sincerely. We just have to find out how this works and register it. But I don't. You must, sweetie, the woman said. Your results have been too good. Izuku just kept his eyes on the ground as he fought back tears. I didn't, he whispered the words. It's okay, Mr. Rikuho was upbeat. Izuku didn't want upbeat. He wanted someone to believe him for once. Someone not his dad or Kurogiri or Gigantomachia. Someone else. Once we find out what aspect of your quirk this is, everything will be fine for next year. The green-haired boy didn't nod. He didn't say anything. There was nothing he could say to that, because he knew, from experience, that they had already made up their minds, and nothing he could do or say would change them. It wasn't fair. He'd just done his best, and yet, he was punished for it. Izuku turned and walked across the field. No one stopped him as he went over to where the parents were spectating. Kurogiri was already waiting next to Gigantomachia. Tomura looked mildly interested, but the smile he gave Izuku was distinctly superior. It told the younger boy without words that he should have expected this outcome. I want to go home, Izuku told Kurogiri. The misty man nodded and no one said anything as he expanded and they walked through. Sir Nighteye looked at the screen. It was the electronic pinboard he had made for the gala where Hiryu Rin had lost his quirk. It had taken weeks, even with the Rin family backing him up to get actual security footage from the gallery. Just the entry hall. They refused to hand over anything more. But it had been enough. Not enough to prove that All For One had taken Hiru's quirk, because no one wanted that going public, but enough for him to prove that the man had been there. Which, unfortunately, since officially All For One did not have a criminal record, was still not enough to enable them to run a facial recognition algorithm over anyone but criminal databases. So he had done this the hard way. Weiji Fumenu was All For One's alias. He owned Changhong, which was listed. 80% of it was owned by 5 different companies, and the remaining 20% was owned by ordinary investors. None of whom had any reason to complain about the dividends paid out. The 5 companies, however, were a different story. Mirai allowed his eyes to track over the links between them and Weiji's Changhong. It was a breathtaking tangle of ownership, counter-ownership and dodgy relationships. And none of it was actually illegal. As far as he could tell, all the companies were legitimate. They had employees and officers. The employees actually existed. And the officers were real. The employees worked there. It was a hugely elaborate setup. It just made him all the more convinced that it was All For One. He was the only criminal Mirai had ever seen that went to this sort of trouble on a routine basis. When he had first met Yagi Toshinori, he would never have believed a villain could be this involved with legitimate business. He would never have believed they could be this cleverly convoluted. He had seen many convoluted plans in his time, but most villains were shallow. All For One was beyond even next level. The companies all traced back to several huge firms. Costco, Cisco, Enterprise were the big ones. They were all legitimate businesses with thousands of employees. All of them had traded for decades. There was nothing wrong with them. If he wanted to say there was, then he would need absolute proof to bring to the Hero Commission. And he didn't have that. If Sir Nighteye was honest with himself, and he mostly was, he knew he wasn't going to get that. Within the tangle of companies, maybe even within the big ones, All For One was there. Somewhere. He'd be executive level, but Mirai had looked over all the images of the company's executives. He might not be able to use facial recognition software, but he had eyes. None of them matched the image they had. Which meant that All For One was using the same trick as he'd used at the gallery. Using someone else's image to replace his own. Except Mirai had reverse-searched each executive's image. He'd even stretched the rules a little. Most were more than happy to accommodate All Might's sidekick. And he'd found nothing. Mirai nodded to himself. He had to keep reminding himself that this was not a petty villain. This was the Emperor of the Underworld. This was a man who had been engaged in crime since the dawn of quirks. He would be careful. He had resources and he wasn't afraid of using those resources. His alias, this time, would be as close to perfect as possible. Sir Nighteye's lips drew into a thin line. Which meant that the gallery, while being a confirmed sighting of All For One, was a bust. Unless more information came to light, he'd tracked down the lead as much as he could and gotten to the same place all the other leads had gotten them. Nowhere. They had events they could tie to him. The murder of Saber Wind. The theft of Hiryu Rin's quirk. They knew he did those things, and while the events tied to him, they never led back to his location. He pushed his glasses up with his middle finger. There had to be something, somewhere. There always was. No villain was perfect. He looked at the image of All for One. He was looking down at something below him. Mirai tapped the image and the entire photo revealed itself. The woman, Inko Midoriya, stood behind a young boy with her hands on his shoulders. It was the boy All for One was looking towards. Sir Nighteye tapped the table as he stared at the image. It had been 4 years since it was taken. Officially, the police had no leads. Unofficially, they had the same dead-end lead that he had about Saber Wind's murder. There had been no information about Izuku Midoriya or Hitoshi Midoriya. But, usually, Mirai thought Toshinori was too optimistic. Toshinori thought the boy was still alive. In this case he agreed. There was something not right with All for One taking the child. There was something they were missing. Or rather, something the police were missing. He hadn't looked into the child angle. He hadn't looked into this case. Perhaps it was time he did. It was time to go back to the beginning, and maybe he could find the kid. He was quirkless, wasn't he? How hard could it be to find him? Izuku heard Tomura snort. "I don't know what you are so surprised about," the older boy said. "Did you really think the world would be fair?" The green-haired boy tried to ignore him. "The bitchet is training to be a hero. So of course they believed her." Tomura continued. Izuku swallowed and then bit the inside of his lip. He didn't want to remember the school sports festival. The gray-haired boy was determined to bring it up. He glanced up, looking at the older boy. He had 2 hands clasped around his neck and another 2 on each arm. There was nothing covering his face, and Izuku could see the way his red eyes glittered. "I didn't cheat," Izuku said tightly. "Oh, I know you didn't," Tomura agreed with a laugh. "I know you did your very best. I know you competed fairly. I know you did nothing wrong." The older boy laughed again. "And I know they don't believe you." He crowed the finishing words. Izuku looked back down at the table. That was the core of the matter. They didn't believe him. Setsuna didn't. She was still insisting that he had to have used his quirk. Mr. Rikuho didn't. He thought there was an undocumented aspect of his quirk. The other teacher hadn't even thought about it. She'd simply sided with Setsuna. His friends. Izuku could tell that Naoki and Shigeru wanted to believe him. They wanted to believe that he'd just done his best. They would love for him to be truly faster than Setsuna, but despite everything they had seen, despite the fact that they spent lunch with him, that they played with him, that they had seen his physical skills since day one, Izuku could tell they had doubts. They knew Setsuna was in training. They knew Setsuna had won the Kanto region trials. They knew nothing. And that hurt. It hurt more than Tomura's gloating over the situation. It hurt more than the way Setsuna still gave him superior grins. They were his friends. They had known him since the beginning of school. They didn't trust him. Didn't believe him. Izuku bit down on his lip so hard he drew blood. He would not cry over this. Not while Tomura was here. Hitoshi believed him. That was something. Hitoshi had even asked his permission to make an offer to the school. The purple-haired boy was prepared to use his quirk, with Izuku's permission, to prove that Izuku hadn't cheated. Everyone had scoffed. Everyone had said that they wouldn't trust Hitoshi to really use his quirk on Izuku because they were friends. It didn't help that Izuku had told them that Hitoshi had already used his quirk on him. That had just gotten Hitoshi into trouble. "There are no real heroes, Izuku," Tomura told him. "And the heroes of this world aren't going to help you. That's why it has to change. That's why they have to go, because in this world, only liars like that bitchet become heroes." Tomura laughed and walked away. Izuku remained at the table. He didn't know what to do. "You must be Hitoshi Shinsu," All for One said as he walked into the room. The purple-haired boy jumped slightly at his voice and then turned in his seat. Quickly the boy stood and bowed slightly at him. "Sit down," Hitoshi said with a smile. "It's good to finally meet you," he said, offering his hand. "I'm Izuku's dad, Hitoshi." Hitoshi took it, but All for One didn't miss the way his eyes were darting back and forth as he searched for Izuku. Or some distraction. "I'm Hitoshi," he confirmed what was already known. "Izuku speaks a lot about you," Hitoshi told the boy as he gestured at the table. Sit, sit, he encouraged, taking his own seat. Hitoshi sat back down. Izuku was here, he said, thinking that All for One was looking for his son. He wasn't. He knew exactly where Izuku was. He was up in his room, searching for the game save that he'd promised to give to Hitoshi. Hisashi knew that because he'd been waiting for an opening. He'd wanted to meet Hitoshi for a very long time. I know, Hisashi told the young boy. But since Izuku brings home friends so rarely, I thought it a good opportunity to meet you, he explained with a grin. Hitoshi looked a little uncomfortable at that. He obviously wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to say it, and wasn't quite impolite enough to just blurt out anything. I heard about the sports festival, Hisashi continued. The boy hung his head. It was very brave of you to offer to use your quirk to clear Izuku. Hisashi continued. That wasn't what Hitoshi had been expecting if the way his head jerked up was any indication. What is your quirk? All for One asked. He already knew the answer, of course. Izuku had told him, and it had been all he could do to not immediately meet Hitoshi and relieve him of it. With the events that had occurred, he knew he'd made the right decision, letting Hitoshi keep his quirk, since he was supporting Izuku, but confirmation was going to be necessary. Hitoshi looked uncomfortable at the question. Mine is fire breath, Hisashi continued, letting wisps of fire escape his mouth. Purple eyes stared at the flame. I'm not fireproof, Hisashi explained. Izuku got that, he added. There was a certain social expectation, even for 8-year-olds, that if someone told you what their quirk was, you reciprocated. Mine is brainwashing, Hitoshi whispered. I know. The boy looked at him sharply. Izuku does talk to me, Hisashi laughed gently. From the way Hitoshi flinched at that, he knew that Shinsu's father didn't speak to his son. Has Izuku asked you about your quirk? All for One ignored the evidence of Shinsu's home life. It wasn't his problem. This time, Hitoshi looked fondly exasperated. I'll take that as a yes, Hisashi said, carrying the conversation. Do you mind if I ask you some questions? He pressed. Again Hitoshi tensed, but as All for One watched, he saw the boy force himself to relax and to nod his permission. Excellent. Hisashi cried happily. Can you brainwash yourself? If you look at yourself in a mirror, can you brainwash yourself? He clarified his question. All for One could tell that Hitoshi hadn't been expecting that question. He'd probably been braced for a question of how to avoid being brainwashed. The purple-haired boy's face looked thoughtful when the surprise faded. He tried, carefully. I don't know, sir. No need to sir me, Hisashi told him. I'm just Izuku's dad. Hitoshi didn't know the answer to that question, but All for One was willing to bet that Hitoshi could brainwash himself. In a way, and not in a mirror. Hitoshi's quirk could be used against him by someone who could take quirks. People usually couldn't protect themselves against their own quirk. After all, it was the one quirk in the world that couldn't be used against them. Let's try another question, All for One said brightly. You can ask about my quirk too, he offered. Does it hurt? Hitoshi immediately put in. Only if I burn myself, Hisashi replied. Can you implant suggestions? He asked. Again Hitoshi's face became thoughtful. Izuku asked the same, he murmured. Hisashi gave a bright smile. His little dragon was getting to the heart of the matter. And before Hitoshi could do anything further, he reached out one hand, with All for One activated, and touched the purple-haired boy's forehead. He was careful this time. Hitoshi remained conscious. Talk to me, All for One commanded, ruffling his hair. Izuku had told him the rudimentary requirements of Hitoshi's quirk. Purple eyes widened, and while Hitoshi wasn't entirely sure what had happened, he couldn't resist asking. What did he fell silent when Hisashi activated his newly acquired quirk? All for One looked at the boy as he felt the quirk within him. It was purple-toned, like its master. Don't worry, you'll be getting it back, he reassured Izuku's friend. The boy didn't say anything. He simply looked back at him with a blank gaze. Hisashi wondered how long the state would apply for before Hitoshi's brain naturally rebooted. There would be a limit, but he had thought about this. He had no idea where Hitoshi would go in his life. If All for One was honest, he had no particular care either, but Hitoshi would support Izuku. He'd make sure of that. If Izuku was going to stand at his right hand, his son was going to need support. Hisashi smiled, and started speaking. Hitoshi listened. He had no choice but to listen. There weren't many instructions. Too many instructions could be misinterpreted or become too complicated. The last were easy though. You will forget this. You will always forget this, until such time as you can accept what it means and still fulfill the instructions. Then you can remember, but with your memory. You will forgive Izuku and you will forgive me. We have done no wrong. Hitoshi paused, briefly considering his words before he nodded to himself. Do you understand? He asked for the verbal confirmation. Yes. Through Hitoshi's quirk, All for One felt the confirmation as well. He grinned. That was useful to know. People couldn't fake being under the boy's quirk. He reached out again, giving the purple quirk one last caress as he pulled up another of his quirks. He hit Hitoshi with memory change. And immediately slipped his quirk back to him. The boy blinked, confused as the memory quirk took effect, and Hitoshi ruffled his hair some more as he drew back his hand. The motion distracted Hitoshi and he looked back towards All for One. You are a good friend, Hitoshi, he told the boy. It was the truth. Even without his instructions, Hitoshi was a good friend. Dad. The wail came from the side. It sounded outraged in the way only an 8-year-old could be. Hitoshi laughed. I have to take my chances to speak to your friends when I can. Little dragon, he told his son. Hitoshi looked slightly embarrassed. You bring them home so infrequently, he added with a laugh. Dad. Izuku cried again as he came over. He was holding the game save. Hitoshi rose. Oh, my little dragon, he said as he ruffled Izuku's hair this time. The gesture was calculated to calm them both and had the desired effect. I'll leave you with your friend, he told his son, before shifting his glance to Hitoshi. It was nice to finally meet you, he told the purple-haired boy. Hitoshi nodded at him, once again being rather shy. Hitoshi, no one here is afraid of your quirk. You can speak without concern, he added. He knew that wasn't the reason Hitoshi wasn't talking. He was probably still slightly disoriented from the memory quirk and the effects of his own quirk, but it was important to get that said. All for One turned away. I'll have Kurogiri send you some snacks, he said by way of parting. As he left, he heard Izuku huff, and that just made him laugh again. Ochaco. Happy birthday. Dad wouldn't let me get you a phone. He said that was something your parents had to get you, even if it would have meant we could have called. Though I don't know your number. And I know ours has changed since the one I gave you. At least we can still write. I got you instead a voucher for that place that sells the gloves you like. I would have gotten you the gloves, but I don't know your size now. It's been way too long since I've seen you. I miss you still. I know I've got Hitoshi, but I still miss you. This isn't about me. Not today. It's about you. Happy birthday. I hope it was a great day. Izuku. Uraraka looked at the letter her friend had sent. She couldn't help but smile. Izuku was still writing to her. She was still writing to him as well, but she didn't know how much longer she'd be able to. Her parents didn't want her to know. She knew though. She knew things were tight. That money was tight and that their construction business just wasn't going that well. They had contracts. They were working, but there just weren't enough contracts. Her parents didn't even bother to scold her now when she helped. They usually hated to see her using her quirk to lift things. They simply smiled at her and pushed the concrete or the wood to where it needed to be. Oh, that's sweet, her mother exclaimed, looking down at the letter. Izuku's handwriting was, as usual, very good, and the letter was decorated with little sketches. Ochaco looked up at her mother. She gulped. I won't write back, she said in a small voice. Tamiko frowned. Why won't you write back? She asked. There was nothing in little Izuku's message that indicated he didn't want to reply. Because it will save money, Ochaco replied. Tamiko could see the tears in her little girl's eyes and her heart clenched. They were struggling a bit, but it wasn't that bad. And she and Sozanushi had thought they were keeping that from their daughter. Obviously not well enough. Ochaco. There is no problem with writing a letter. But it costs money to send it, Ochaco objected. They needed to save money. Tamiko embraced her daughter. She couldn't think of anything else to do. It doesn't cost that much, she told Ochaco. And it's good for you to have a friend to write to. But, tell you what, Tamiko interrupted. Her daughter did not need to be worrying about money at this age. Why don't you ask for Izuku's number when you write back and you can surprise him with a call? You can use our phone, Petal Pumpkin. Sozanushi told his daughter. He and his wife would have to be more careful around their daughter. You promise it's not a problem? Ochaco whispered the question. I promise. Himiko answered cheerfully. They may be having some problems, but they could afford stamps and a phone call. Ochaco nodded. Okay. Little Dragon. My birthday was good. Thank you for the voucher. I got some winter gloves. They are so warm even though we haven't had any snow yet. It's still cold. Have you gotten any snow? I know you said Saitama doesn't usually get snow, but have you? Mum and Dad said I should ask you for your number. They said I can call you with their phone. I have been able to keep practicing using my quirk. Mum and Dad just tell me what to lift, but they never really let me strain. I only threw up once. How was I to know that the concrete block was solid? Still, I know I can't lift that much yet. I'm afraid, Little Dragon. My parents tell me it's okay to write, and that it's okay to phone you, that we can afford it, but I hear them at night. They aren't getting enough contracts. The ones they are getting are small. They tell me not to worry, but I want to help them somehow. They shouldn't have to worry about that. I don't know how though. Oh, I shouldn't be worrying you. I just want to help them somehow, but I don't know how. Not really. They say I don't have to help out on the jobs, but I want to. And I know they need it. It helps things go faster and saves having to hire a forklift. I'm not sure what else I can do. Minato's little sister, Ayame, is going to begin school next year. He tells me she usually wears her hair long and bright hot pink. He likes it. Not the color so much, but that's mostly because his parents think it's too bright. She's apparently trying to work on getting color stripes in there, but that is requiring more practice for her. Kazu is moving away at the moment. I think her dad got a new job somewhere, but I don't know what company. She seemed happy, but she hasn't given me a new address. I don't think she's even given Minato her phone number. Why would she do that? Lots of love. Ochaco. Himiko. It's me. Izuku. You didn't have a phone when I left school and I forgot to ask for your address. I got Kurogiri to help me find it so that I can write to you at least. Dad gave me a phone. It's only for emergencies though, and yes, I spelt that by myself. The number is 123,456,789. Call me if you want. I miss you. My new school is okay, though they thought I cheated at the school sports festival. I came in first a lot. There's a girl. Her name is Setsuna and she is training to be a hero. She wasn't happy that I beat her. I didn't cheat though. She thought I was using a quirk tilde. It's just training with Kurogiri. We've moved on to some fighting technique now, though it's mostly dodging. It's good because I can avoid Tomura. He showed me a move too, but I can't do it yet. It throws someone over your head. It's so cool. I do have a friend at school. His name is Hitoshi. I think you'd like him. I wish all my friends could meet each other. Maybe one day. Hitoshi has a quirk like yours. Nothing to do with blood. People don't like him using it. I don't get it. He doesn't use it for fun. He did use it on me once, but that's because Gigantomachia startled him. He didn't mean it. His quirk is brainwashing. If you answer him, he can make you do what he wants. It's so cool. The applications are amazing. If you have a phone, text me, otherwise write back please. I miss you. Izuku. End chapters 32 and 33, The Emperor's Dragon. Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.